Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th week of CRISPR-Con 2020. I'm Johanna Gibbs with the Keystone Policy Center. Keystone is a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy organization bringing together diverse perspectives and experiences on societal challenges. Keystone Policy Center is based in Keystone, Colorado, on the lands of the Ute people. We're proud to facilitate CRISPR-Con's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. CRISPR-Con aims to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal history and context relevant to the decisions on gene editing technologies in applications of health, conservation, and agriculture. 2020 is CRISPR-Con's 4th year. In the virtual format, we have 10 webinars and 5 themes over 2 months. Throughout the entire series, we have a broad-ranging lineup of speakers, including life scientists, social scientists, journalists, business leaders, farmers, conservationists, consumer advocates, social justice advocates, global economic development leaders, religious leaders, funders, philanthropists, and more. If you missed any of our earlier virtual sessions, we encourage you to check them out on our CRISPR-Con YouTube channel, which includes free access to our discussions dating back to 2017. So far this year, we've discussed gene editing in the context of race and health disparities, indigenous perspectives, storytelling, journalism, gene editing in research in China, framing and governance of risk and benefits in gene editing in agriculture and food, considerations for climate, conservation, and justice. Planning for this week's session was conducted in partnership with the Innovative Genomics Institute. Thanks to the whole IGI team, and special thanks to Lee and Kevin. We also want to thank our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPR-Con and our ability to create these important conversations. Our programmatic sponsors are Corteva and United Soybean Board. You can visit the virtual expo within Hopin for relevant past CRISPR-Con content and to learn more about this week's partners and sponsors. Let me now further introduce our session for today. This week, CRISPR-Con will explore themes of priority and agenda setting. Today, we'll explore gene editing in public health and health autonomy. This session will explore the complexities and trade-offs of gene editing-focused health approaches for treatment versus prevention, as well as the scale and significance of impact for individuals versus society at large. We hope that the dialogue will bring lots of lively discussion among panelists and participants. If you are joining us via Hopin, please use the stage chat to submit questions for the panelists at any time during the panel conversation. Those viewing on YouTube will be able to watch the whole session live, but won't be able to submit questions. Divergence and disagreement are welcome. Please be empathetic, curious, engaged, respectful, as you listen and share across various perspectives. So at this time, I'd like to invite the panelists to join me on stage. I'll ask each of them to share their audio and video as I begin to introduce them. We'll hear more from each of our panelists on their background presently. More detailed bios are available at CRISPRcon.org website. Our moderator, David Sittenfeld, is from the Boston Museum of Science. David, can you please join me on stage? Rena Conti is the Associate Research Director of Biopharma and Public Policy at Boston University. Glenn Ellis is a visiting scholar at the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee University. Alyssa Pritchard is from the World Economic Forum. And Sharon Terry is the President and CEO of the Genetic Alliance. I will now be removing myself from the screen so that Sharon can come on, and we'll be turning things over to David to moderate a discussion of gene editing, public health, and health autonomy.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, it took me a second to get so I could share my video and audio. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Johanna. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and many thanks to the CRISPR-Con organizers for putting together this conversation. I think it's really important that we're having this conversation right now at this point where this technology is, and we'll hear a lot about different perspectives on that, because there are so many emerging technologies, from the internet to the roadway system, in which we have not really sufficiently been able to consider the implications and set priorities and agendas together as a society until the outcomes were already deeply entrenched and polarized and therefore inherently less equitable. As part of my work at the Museum of Science in Boston, my colleagues and I have facilitated conversations at science museums at hundreds of institutions around the societal and ethical dimensions of gene editing technologies as part of a large-scale national science-funded public engagement project. And will be part of an upcoming global deliberation on human genome editing that was recently described in Science Magazine and an NIH-funded project with Arizona State University and the Baylor College of Medicine. The reason I mention this is that one thing we've learned from facilitating these kinds of conversations is that any potential treatment or therapy, whether it's an approach that could reduce the burden of widespread disease across populations such as malaria, techniques that could treat rare disease like Huntington's in a single person, or reduce risks of things like sickle cell or certain cancers that are more common in some populations, or even to try to eliminate the disease from the human population altogether. Each of these case studies brings forward a different set of considerations and different stakeholders, along with individual and societal decision makers. And they bring up issues of equitable access, cost, risk, autonomy, and privacy. And we know that having these conversations is essential given the way that emerging technologies such as gene editing present inequities, disparities, and opportunities for different kinds of people. So this is a good time for us to have this discussion, and I'm really excited that we have these panelists that you'll hear from in just a moment to help us explore these ideas. I think they're a great group to do so. I do want to begin by acknowledging the political, social, technological developments and uncertainties at this time, and also recognize that the ongoing pandemic has disrupted all of our systems, exacerbated disparities and inequities, and sort of really put the face of injustice forward as a society. And so there could be any number of political developments, breakthroughs, or events that change this conversation drastically as we've been living through drastic change over the last few months together as a society. But I think that's an even more important reason that the discussion happen now and be extended to people who aren't talking about this technology, because the decisions and developments are being made with or without their ideas and values represented. So when considering all of these potential futures together at the same time, we realize that there's kind of an overarching question that we'll be exploring today with our panelists, and that is, how can we equitably maximize the benefit of gene editing technologies for everyone across each of these decision points while minimizing negative and or unanticipated consequences? And so that means that priority and agenda setting is really important, and it be inclusive and widespread. So we're really fortunate to have a fantastic and interesting group of people who will be talking about that now. And Alyssa, Glenn, Sharon, and Rena will be describing things from their perspective and weighing in and answering one another's questions and questions from you. And you can read their details bio on the website. I'd love to start by having each of you briefly tell us a little bit about yourselves and your work on the issues of gene editing, public health, and health autonomy through the lens of the question, sort of, where are we from your perspective right now, and how did we get here when it comes to your perspective on gene editing? And I'll go ahead and start with Alyssa. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning from San Francisco, everybody. My name is Alyssa Pritchard. I work at the World Economic Forum. I'm a lead on the platform for shaping the future of health and healthcare. And while my portfolio here is very broad, something I've been focused on since joining the forum is what we call leapfrogging with precision medicine. And in other words, how do we help support bring precision medicine approaches to emerging economies? And it's a really critical area to focus on, because what we don't want to see is that the rise of precision medicine will increase health disparities globally. And there is a real possibility, if we don't think ahead about shaping the trajectory of how precision medicine continues to develop. So within that, work, one of the things I've released recently is a toolkit on genomic data policy and ethics, which looks at how can we start to shape the trajectory of this. So with that, kind of where are we headed? Where we are is we're early on. And when it comes to kind of the issues of equity, and I'm talking a little bit more broadly than gene editing when I'm talking about precision medicine. When I look at emerging economies in particular, there's a lack of policies that are governing how genetic information is collected and used. And that's really, really critical, because if there is not approaches to protect people, to outline how that information is collected, how it's consented, how it's kept private, how it's accessed, and if there's then benefit sharing back down the chain, and all of this being done in a ethical context that meets local needs, then there is the very strong possibility that things will go wrong, and the populations that can most benefit from finally being included in research in an appropriate way will not benefit then from the research, and chances are governments will start to lock out research from happening. And we've seen examples of this where things have gone wrong and populations have said, we're done, we're not interacting. So I think I'm looking forward to talking more about this, but going to hand it back to you, David.
Thanks for bringing those perspectives. And I'm sure a lot of these things that you brought up about the right role of regulation, how to consider, use of data, these are going to come up and talk about these conversations. Glenn, I'd love to hear your perspective on this sort of guiding question of where are we from your perspective, and how did we get here?
Thank you, David, and good morning to everyone and all of these distinguished panelists that I'm humbled to be a part of. My name is Glenn Ellis. As you mentioned, I am a visiting scholar at the National Bioethics Center for Healthcare and Research at Tuskegee University, and currently I'm a fellow at the Bioethics Center at Harvard Medical School on research bioethics and narrative ethics. My perspective is that where we are is, I think we're in a conundrum trying to figure out what I see as after the fact, looking at the issue of equity with this technology. And I think that we have done our society a disservice by not examining that question as this technology was first introduced and subsequently resourced and prioritized in the context of research, without having made sure that issues around equity and the proper stewardship and allocation of resources as it related to the entire healthcare system and all of the priorities in terms of what health needs our society has, and how this has elevated itself to such a high status without having addressed some of the basic fundamental aspects of our medical and healthcare system. So my work is centered around, I have about almost over 15 years of being a primary reviewer on many different IRBs. And so this research is something that I've seen from its genesis. And I've watched how the lack of oversight to ensure the proper degree of inclusion and equitable application was not really mandated or enforced throughout its development. And so we're at a point now where I think we're in a conundrum now, trying to fix something that was broken from the beginning in that regard as it relates to equity.
Thanks for your perspective, Glenn. And again, I think this idea of what equitable review and what equitable systems need to look like as this technology unfolds is going to be something that I'm sure many of us will be thinking about and talking about during this conversation. Thanks for your perspective. Rena, I'd like to go to you now. Again, where do you think we are, and how did we get here?
Sure, good morning. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. So I'm an economist, and I am currently an associate professor of economics and Boston University's Custom School of Business. I also am the Associate Director of New Technology, specifically biopharmaceutical policy and economics. So here we are. So I've studied this industry for the past 20 years. There is evidence to suggest that the application of this policy of these types of technologies to human disease may offer significant benefits to individuals, but also comes at significant cost, in part because they are applied to small patient populations and require such incredible effort, both in terms of the research and development, but also ongoing of these products. Thank you. My most recent work suggests that we are both in the beginning stages, as Alyssa mentioned, but also right in the middle of this new technology development, as Glenn alludes to. And let me tell you how. We are in the beginning stages of these new technologies coming to market and actually being used in the clinic. However, we are in the middle stages of these new technologies coming to clinical trials and having investors and innovative companies invest in them, interact with our current healthcare system, and also interact with our regulators in terms of establishing safety, efficacy, and standards for what the basis of the trials and what the basis of approval will be. We think that there are approximately 30 therapies that will come to market in the next 10 to 15 years, but there are over 300 therapies that are in various stages of development. As Glenn alluded to, and Alyssa did as well, I would say we are still working out the regulatory basis for approval of these products. We are also still working out exactly how they will be used in the clinic, since clearly what the trials suggest the patient population eligible will be different than what happens in the real world. And maybe most importantly, we are really just at the beginning stage of trying to figure out how we're going to pay for them. These therapies will come with price tags of $1 million per treated patient easily. We don't expect those prices to come down over time. And at least 1/3 of the patient population that we anticipate will be eligible for these therapies, or the target of these therapies, at least in the next 10 years, will be publicly insured or privately insured, where insurers face very significant incentives to not provide access to these therapies. So who's going to get access, and how will ability to pay feed into access to these therapies? I think we're in the early days of trying to figure out. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rena, for your perspective. Yeah, I'm already thinking of questions based on everything that we're hearing from our very thoughtful speakers. But I want to go to Sharon now and hear your perspective on this introductory question of where we are right now with respect to this technology and how you feel like we got here.
Great, thanks very much. I'm Sharon Terry, and I'm president and CEO of Genetic Alliance, which is a health advocacy organization, an umbrella of about 2,000 disease advocacy groups. I've worked about 20 years in this field because my 2 kids were diagnosed with a rare genetic condition 25 years ago. I'm also been very active in trying to find ways for us to have public dialogue about this, helping to co-found the Roundtable for Genomics and Health with the National Academies, and also served on the gene editing committee that ended in 2017, the first one, not the one that just completed its work. And I certainly agree with the other panelists that we are in a position where the technology is racing ahead. I was also very involved in the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, leading the coalition that helped get that passed. And one thing that we said all those years ago still applies, which is we really need the policies of this country and other countries to precede the technologies, and that doesn't always happen. And it's been my dearest hope that we have the kind of public engagement and dialogue we need in a broad way, and not just in some elite halls around investors and companies. I think also this lands squarely in the major problem of health equity and access for the world, and then in particular countries like the US, where there is a propensity toward high costs for therapies that don't need to be as highly priced as they are, and that we have allowed a lot that some other countries don't, and therefore are creating greater inequities for the world. And so I have a great deal of concern about this.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to all the panelists for laying things out so, I think, well and effectively for us to have this kind of conversation. As Brianna said in the chat, we would love to have you join us in the chat with questions or comments, and the organizers will do their best to sort of tie that together in ways that we'll be able to chime in on as we go. I'm going to start with a few questions from my perspective, and we're kind of going to walk through 4 parts of our conversation. The first part is going to start with the idea of, do we need to prioritize application of this technology given all the possible therapies and methods that we're talking about, and some of the issues about access and cost and equity that we've been hearing about from our speakers. Is that necessary? And if so, you know, why? The second question is, with respect to this priority and agenda setting, what are the choices that we need to make as a society? What are the things that we really need to figure out? You've touched on that a little bit, and we can get more specific. The third question is, who needs to be brought into the conversation, and how do we do that in truly equitable and authentic manner with a technology that, as many of you have been talking about, is inaccessible because of cost, is happening rapidly, is complex in terms of what it means and where it's going to go, and there's a lot of uncertainty priced in to that. And then the final part I hope we'll get to is this question about what success and equity looks like for this technology, your North Star, where if you could make it all happen, you're pushing things as best you can towards a goal to try to get us to maximize the benefits for everyone in an equitable way, and what that looks like for you with respect to your perspective. And I want to start with something that Rena told us about, you know, the idea of 300 possible therapies being considered, and what that might mean for people who are either making decisions about this technology, or, you know, suffering from the diseases that they're intended to treat, and the equity, cost, and access issues that we heard about from all of our panelists. I want to start with this question of do we need to prioritize application of this technology? Should we just let you know, the market figure this out? Over the next several years, we have this question about whether we're going to prioritize working towards population health outcomes, or whether we're really going to talk about sort of trying to maximize the personalized medicine trajectory so that people can make decisions, you know, about things that they particularly are thinking about rather than things that affect an entire population. Do we need to choose? I'll start with that question, and why or why not? Feel free to just chime in.
Okay, I'll begin, which is, so the market chooses. Innovators and investors are making decisions every day about the new technology that they're investing in, and that will come to market. Much of that, the vast majority of those choices ultimately end in failure. In other words, these products won't come to market. But we do have some indication that gene therapies, including CRISPR-based technologies, might have a higher failure rate than other therapeutics that are coming to market for a variety of scientific and manufacturing reasons. But that being said, the choice is not precision medicine or chronic disease management. We have to do both. We're the richest country in the world. We are the country that brings these new technologies to market, and they're coming. What we really have to be making choices about, and choices about now, is how to make sure that that the people who stand to benefit from these technologies can actually access them, and at a price that will not bankrupt their families or the system at large. As I mentioned, my new research suggests we're on the verge of having approximately 30 of these therapies, that if you kind of think about them broadly, in the next 15 years. That's not even priced at current prices. It's not an insurmountable amount of money. The question is redistributing money from those who have really good insurance to those who don't, and making sure the folks who are eligible for these therapies and don't have good insurance can actually stand to benefit for them. I fear if we do not have that conversation fundamentally about redistribution and treating patients that are eligible with therapies that they stand to benefit from, a lot of our other conversations about what we owe to each other, and also how we ensure that science is for all Americans or for all the world, are going to unravel, and they're going to unravel very quickly.
So Rena's perspective is that we need to do both, and we don't necessarily have to choose between what this is often framed as a debate, right, between the deadliest diseases and the costliest diseases. And Rena's arguing that we don't need to make that distinction. What are other people's perspective on this question?
I'm also a proponent of both. I think, at a very basic level, science builds on previous science. So we have a long way to go in understanding what drives disease, how that differs across populations, and to take this maybe a step back a little bit into data. So what we've seen in the context of COVID, for example, is absolutely apparent in front of our faces every day, the health disparities that are happening. These are not new. These are part of a long-standing systemic issue. And that is also built into what may come about with gene therapy. There is a huge disparity in who's included in research. Research right now on genetic information is, and I've seen different numbers, but 70 to 80% done on Caucasian populations, which means we don't fully understand. And again, we're at early stages in this area of medicine, but we don't fully understand the risk factors, the differences, the potential targets for populations that are not Caucasian. So if a development is made, it may not work well on everybody, and we just won't know. So I fear if we stop prioritizing, and maybe prioritizing is the wrong word, but balancing how we're investing in the advancement of science in this space versus other areas of healthcare, that we're inadvertently or going to continue to expand this gap in healthcare disparities, because we will be leaving populations very far behind.
Thank you. Other perspectives?
This is Sharon. I agree with that as well, and also would add to that that I wish that the developers would understand that actually the science would go faster, and we will learn more if we're more inclusive. There's always the short game for investors; they want to see how they can get an ROI pretty quickly, and that requires doing these shortcuts with populations right in available, and that in fact themselves are not terribly engaged either. So I think upping the engagement game around the globe, creating incentives for us to involve more populations and to understand what we're putting forward more deeply. As Rena said, there's a lot of failure here, and there's going to be less failure if we are more inclusive, if we do have more people enrolled in clinical trials and have them really be participants rather than just subjects. That's a long shot because of the way that the market economies work, but it's one that I continue to hope for and work for.
Can I just respond to Sharon? I completely agree with you. And I think that some of the notable potential successes in this market are in places where the patient communities have advocated for outcomes that matter to themselves, and the companies themselves have heard those patient communities and really designed the trials to actually capture outcomes that matter. And then it's really a partnership between the patient groups and the companies going to the regulator, going to the payers and saying, hey, these matter to us. We think we can see benefit. We're engaged in the science. And if and when these things come to market, we want a fair shot of getting access to them. We've seen this with other types of disease, not just genetic-based disorders, and it works very well. In places where there is significant divergence, where the innovators cut corners and don't do patient and payer engagement early and often, we've seen significant disparities in access.
Let me just say a couple things. One, all of the communities don't have the voice to be able to make sure that they can communicate what they need. So those are the people who have been totally excluded from this entire process. And it has led to us being at a point where we don't have equity in this particular technology and this science. And I think that Sharon said something about, to the point of how all the voices that need to be involved should be involved, and they're not being involved. And so what we have to go back and look at, because we have to, I think all of this is predicated on us. We have to honestly ask ourselves, who do we want to be as a society? Because we have to acknowledge the extent to which just not having had this much forethought and this much conversation and this much attention has already driven how, from a bioethical point of view, this is a violation of just allocation of resources. And I don't have, I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't have the data certainly available right now, but I would really like to know just to what extent we have disproportionately resourced this technology in light of all of the fundamental societal things that science and research could be addressing that are more comprehensively impacting and affecting broader senses of who we are as a nation or as a society. So the consciousness that drove this technology is the same consciousness that has led to the historical inequities in our healthcare and medical system. And so now what we're trying to do, we're at a juncture with this development of this and rollout of this technology to try to, in my opinion, put some window dressing on it to make it appear that there's some commitment to equity when there really isn't, because there isn't. This technology and all of this research is not taking place in a vacuum. This is a part of the entire healthcare, medical, and research industries that have, as Lisa pointed out, they're systemically inequitable. So there's nothing that was infused in the conversation and the consciousness around this particular technology that accommodated or provided some type of adjustment for the lack of that type of consciousness and everything else that surrounds it in the healthcare and medical field. So it's the same consciousness, it's the same sense of exclusion, it's the same sense of privilege, it's the same sense of all of the things that have led to the systemic inequities in our society. And so I just think to try to now ask us, all of us, whose voices need to be included. If you have to ask that question, then we have to know that there's something fundamentally flawed and unjust about CRISPR and all of the technology associated with it.
I appreciate your perspective, Glenn, and I think I have some questions, and I see some bubbling up in the discussion. Good questions that we'll get to when we talk about not only equitable development but also access and deployment in a couple of minutes. I want to get back to one thing that I heard from several of the speakers, which is if we are indeed going to commit to investing across the board in population health, where we have large scale diseases that we want to try to address across the board, as I said, or maximizing autonomy and personalized medicine for some people. How do we do that? What is a step that we can take right now to make sure that happens? And to your point, Glenn, addresses historic inequities that are going to be exacerbated if people don't think about them and address them in a way that is retrospective. What are the things that we can do right now? I know in our conversation yesterday, some people were talking about the importance of data and the importance of looking at the information that we have. What are some concrete things that need to get done for us to not lose one or the other of these important possible trajectories for this technology?
If I could just chime in first, I think one of the things we have to do is acknowledge that there's no real uniform system for even collecting racial data. We don't even know what we don't know about that. So it's left undone because nobody knows. And I think the other thing that we need to really understand and acknowledge is that there are no researchers involved in this work of color. So there's no consciousness to even inform the processes from start to finish that would really be reflective of both the needs, the interest, the perspective of those populations that are included, the ones that we're now trying to figure out how do we bring those voices into the table. Because it's been a very monolithic type of mindset that has brought this forth. And I think we do ourselves a disservice not to continually acknowledge and recognize that there is systemic racism. I haven't heard that word used yet, but there's race. This is a systemically racist healthcare and medical system. And it's further complicated by the fact that it's one of the only, if certainly not one of the very few in the developed world whose healthcare and medical system is tied to the free market, right? So we got to understand what those dynamics means. It means that those decisions are going to be driven by where there can be. I think, David, you mentioned about the ROI. Investors want, or no, it's Sharon, I forget who it was, but you mentioned that these, the people who are investing and funding this stuff are looking for ROI, as you would with anything, whether they're making widgets or pipes or whatever it is. This is what the free market calls for. So when you infuse that type of expectation into something that has, in its purest sense, no connection to return on investment, we got to understand the convoluted nature of what we're trying to make sunshine out of some dark, stormy, cloudy weather. But this is a real heavy lift, but it's possible. We can move forward. We can make this an equitable application to the healthcare needs of our societies around this planet. But we have to acknowledge what's really broken with it. Instead of whatever we have now at this time, say, okay, let's keep it moving forward. You got to know what's fundamentally wrong. And there's something fundamentally wrong about where we are as it relates to CRISPR. There's problems. We know, when you look at some of the technologies around artificial intelligence and, facial recognition and what's in the databases, that are being used to inform this type of research. Who's in the database? So all of these things are flawed. So bringing people into the conversation and adding new voices is not going to mitigate the damage that those other fundamental flaws are doing to what is some very great, useful research that this technology has to offer. But we got to contextualize it. We have to look at it in the context of where does this fit in to the whole picture, and how does it fit in to continue to contribute to making us a more just and equitable healthcare system.
Thank you. Other ideas for things that we can do to sort of ensure that we keep our portfolio broad and we think about these population level negative health, positive and negative health outcomes, as well as particularly addressing needs and inequities that we've heard about, which we'll get back to in a couple of minutes for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a different perspective on this, which is that just remember that this technology was funded by public dollars to universities and researchers at those universities. And ultimately, now that there are potential technologies, it has been flipped over to the private sector. But really, I would say it is our public institutions that failed here. And there are really two failures. The first is we don't have national registries of rare diseases that exist and are maintained and are refreshed on a regular basis. We need that. We need that to assess what the needs are of the populations, and we need that to assess how these new technologies can be may impact populations with their communities and their voices at the table at the beginning of the public investment, not at the end. So secondly, I would say that much of the public science was driven both by we want to be on the frontier, and there's a lot of really good reasons why we should be on the frontier of this type of science, but also a suggestion of import to public health and import to vulnerable populations without making absolutely sure that those vulnerable populations had a seat at the table when we were doing actually the basic science and ultimately the clinical trials. And let me be a little bit more concrete. Some of these therapies came some of the backbone of the new technology came on the heels of promises that we are going to help particular populations that are very vulnerable with new technology. Okay, great. But those populations did not sit on the study sections reviewing whether or not this scientist should get public funds or not. Those populations were not guaranteed participation in the trials or in the design of those trials. And so now we have the situation where these therapies have moved from public science to private science with no representation and no understanding of what the populations themselves are facing in terms of access, in terms of what the outcomes matter, etc. So these are things that can be righted. They can be done tomorrow. A national database on rare disease that is maintained and by all investigators, and real representation on public science boards that are ensuring both basic science and more translational science is inclusive. It's not just waving our hands at the problem. It's not saying, oh yeah, we never really accrue as much as we want to for marginalized populations. This has to be central to the public science endeavor.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Sharon or Glenn.
I just
Go on,
I'll
Sarah.
just say quickly. So I very much agree with that. I run Registries for Rare Diseases, a platform that I've built called Promise for engaging everyone responsibly, both the technology and the policies. And we have never been supported at all by anything in society except bake sales and car washes from rare disease groups. And that is a travesty. And I do think the systemic problem of the universities trying to capitalize on things is quite remarkable. We rare disease groups fund research, and then they take 100% funded by us technologies and bring them to the private sector, patent them, and produce them, and just put high price tags on things. I also think if we had leadership from the top, if the director of the NIH and CDC and FDA and the places that are funding research said it's a requirement with public dollars that the public benefit, and stop this flow to the private sector. And I get that they believe that investigator initiated science is better than us coming to consensus and doing prior, and exploiting these technologies for money is going to be beneficial. But this cycle is not working, and we need to change it now, and can change it. I agree with Rena. It can be changed like this.
Glenn, and then Alyssa, please.
Please. Please.
I was already muted. So I was actually going to try to add a couple extra questions on top of this, and I think it is critical to have raised the point that, you know, how can we be more inclusive in building out CRISPR and building out gene therapies, but doing it in a way that attends to the ethical and legal implications, so that there isn't further harms, discriminations, exploitations of people. The other questions I kind of wanted to layer on that are, you know, one, what kind of health system do we want to create? Are we building a future of health type health system, or are we also trying to, you know, kind of fit in gene therapy to the system that currently exists? And you know, that whether it's US or global isn't going to work. The system wasn't designed for these types of therapies. So for, you know, emerging economies where there's greenfield policy space, the questions are, but very, very limited resources. How can a system be built out that attends to both the practicalities of basic care and treating infectious disease and making the whole population healthy, while also starting to figure out economically how to build in approaches that could benefit societies, such as gene therapy approaches for sickle cell. And it might just be starting with diagnosis. You know, I'm working with the government of Rwanda and physicians at Dana-Farber to figure out how do we start to understand BRCA mutations in the Rwandan population, and if that's driving their high incidence of breast cancer, so that then we can figure out a treatment approach that might be more effective than what's currently happening. So, you know, how can we think about building a future of healthcare system? Also, I think, you know, two other things, and I'll hand it over to Glenn, that I just wanted to throw out, and maybe it'll drive some additional conversation. When there is a lack of trust between people and their healthcare system, governance becomes incredibly important. So including people in the governance models, but also just making sure they're there, making sure that people are starting to design a system and frameworks around the system that are trustworthy, because certainly the relationships between patients, research participants, researchers, government members, corporations, others, has not been a trustworthy one. And then the other thing I wanted to throw out is just this affordability piece. I think one of the things that, you know, is tough is gene therapies are very, very expensive, but they potentially offer cures. And our system was not set up, our system in the United States and other countries, not set up for these huge one-time payments. And while over the lifetime, they may save the system money up front, they strain the system immensely. So how can we start to rethink about that? So equity from from beginning to end, inclusion to access to affordability to quality are things I wanted to throw out on top of this conversation.
Thank you. Glenn, please.
I just want to chime in on a couple of things. One, I think Sharon mentioned about leadership from the top is required. Was it Sharon or Rena? I forget. Either way, but I was involved in as an IRB board member at different institutions. When I started, Bill Clinton was president. So I served on IRBs throughout every presidential administration since then, through Barack Obama's up to the current one. And all of their administrations, at no point was that those administrations comprised of leadership that enforced existing regulations that ensured equity and particularly equitable use of public funds for research. There was no enforcement on accrual and enrollment in trials. There was no enforcement to look at retention. There was none. And so that goes back to the earlier point I'm making, is just that we have to acknowledge how flawed this science was from the beginning and how exclusionary and almost elite it was in its lobbying. The voices who were able to push this were not the voices that represented those who could benefit most from it and their related and respective rare diseases. So we have to understand. I just think that and this is, I'm a visiting scholar at the National Bioethics Center for Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University. So mistrust, and particularly in the population of Blacks in this country, is always pointing to that study. But the real issue is the mistrust by us of knowing that was the United States government. That was not some mad scientist in a dark basement kidnapping poor Black farmers and snatching them into a lab and doing things to them. So when have we ever seen enough demonstrated by the government and the leadership who are the stewards of our public funds and this type of public research? We've never seen examples where there's a reason to have trust. So all of those things, and particularly now you're moving into a science that is so advanced and removed from the vernacular of most people, and certainly in this country, if not around the world. This is some very advanced stuff. So it already is so distant from people. So it's positioned to be only available and mostly available to those who have the money and the means and the motivation to take advantage of it. So this conversation to say, how do we find equity? We have to begin. And I'm just grateful to have a voice to bring these types of things to conversations, because as evidenced by how we got to where we are, there was no, and certainly not enough of these types of voices involved in informing the whole enterprise of where we're going with this thing.
Thank you, Glenn. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I completely agree. And I know that we have a participant question following up on Sharon's comment that we should have public benefit baked into privately designed science. I would say something slightly different, which is that our system of publicly funded basic science and privately invested development and supply works exceptionally well in most cases. The main issue here is that this is technology that is born from the intention of treating very vulnerable patient populations. And so what we get out at the other side is driven by what we start with. And so if we don't attend to this particular needs of those vulnerable populations at the beginning, we can't rely on the private market or privately invested science to do the right thing. They won't. So really, we need to begin at the beginning, which is making sure that our public institutions are right-facing, right-sized, and have the proper leadership to do this the right way. On the other side, the horse is already out of the barn, right? We're going to get 30 or more new technologies in the next 10 years. What do we do with those? And what do we owe this population, I think, is really fundamentally the issue, which is, again, we can't have new technologies that were intended to treat very vulnerable populations, for which those very vulnerable populations will not be able to get access to them. We have to find ways, public and private, that ensure access now that these new therapies are coming.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings me really well to the next question. We heard from Rena and others earlier that efficacy is an important piece of this, and that, like, of those 30 that Rena's talking about, not all of them are going to do what we wish they could. And so there's this question about sort of the deployment of the gene editing. So far, our conversation has focused a lot on research and how we can make the research fit the needs of our society, particularly in light of societal inequities and systemic racism and the cumulative harms and exposures to negative health stressors that we've been hearing about. And I want to talk a little bit now about deployment. So, even if technologies are developed equitably, however we define that, there's this question about how people will access these technologies. And in particular, at a time when 30 or so technologies may become available to us over the next 10 years, as Rena's telling us, how should we think a little bit about who needs to benefit most from the early applications, and how to look at that when we set agendas, and who pays for that, and how do we keep that affordable at a time when I see people in the chat asking good questions about the trade-off between publicly funded research that all of us paid for and things that then are privatized and patented. I don't have a particular, question to ask here, but want to bring it up and see, what does that make you think about when you consider this question about who should benefit from early applications, or what are the possible considerations? And we heard Alyssa talking a little bit about this earlier. I'm just interested in all of your perspectives on it.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Who should benefit are the vulnerable populations that Rena was just talking about, and that integration of those communities and their voices, as Glenn was saying, has to happen from the start. And we're already starting from a bad place because we do have systemic racism and we have inequities built into the system. I'm not opposed to patenting. I own the patent on the gene associated with my kid's disease because I discovered it myself with my master's in theology in a lab in Boston, borrowing bench space at night. I think what is different is we need to then, from that point, decide how do we equitably distribute these technologies, and also engage the public in a way that makes it easier to build them. So again, if we go back to having these communities involved all the way, we won't be spending $4,000 to $100,000 per person to be enrolled through a CRO, and that cost right there. And then I think the other thing is we need Medicare, Medicaid, CMS to really look at technologies. And I know they do, but they take their time, and they maybe aren't listening to the public outcry around the disparities here. So a good example is there's a bill in Congress right now to get whole genome sequencing for babies in the NICU. We know that some 60% of them could be diagnosed with whole genome sequencing that now costs $800 a kid. And instead, right now, Medicaid won't pay for that. So we don't have a way to have our voices heard very well, particularly in this administration. We had a better megaphone in the prior one. But I think we really do need this kind of public discourse. And I've only just mentioned America. In some places in Europe, actually, negotiations are much better and much more in favor of the public and equality and equity than they are here. And maybe we need to take a page from their book. And then I think it was Alyssa who said these green fields where policy's not yet written are excellent places to leapfrog the kinds of mistakes that we've made.
Thank you, Sharon. Other perspectives on this question of who benefits from the first, tranche of these technologies? How do we keep it affordable? Who's paying for it?
David, I would even take it a little step back before that question and say, how do you even determine who needs to benefit from it? What's the metric, or what's the mechanism? What's the process to determine that? How equitable is that process? See, how is the list comprised of who needs to benefit, and who's determining what's on that list? So I'm just saying we got to look at all of the dynamics, and to just start at this point is already taking some assumed notions about what the range of beneficiaries are and who comprises that list. But I'm saying, is that equitable? What's the barometer we're using? Whose ethics are we basing this on? Is it a societal ethic, or is it a privileged class ethic that is an outgrowth of the systemic racism that our healthcare and medical system is built upon? So I just think that, if we're going to be sincere in our effort to try to address this huge problem of inequity with this science and this technology, then we have to be honest about how we're going to go and approach it. And I think the starting point isn't to just start with what we got now. The starting point is to say, how did we even get this? What was the determining factors that helped to comprise this whole list that now we're going to base on prioritizing and deciding who gets it?
I want to get to regulation in a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about that. But before we do, I think the issues that you're bringing up, Glenn, connect to this good question from Roderick. And I guess thinking a little bit about, how we can get our government and I think others too, to incentivize authentic public engagement around this issue. So I think it's great that CRISPR-Con is facilitating this conversation and that 50 some odd people are listening and participating. But how do we get people who are not thinking about this issue very much to authentically engage and to bring the perspectives that we're hearing about on this, the perspectives about money, the perspectives about intellectual property, the perspectives about equity, fairness, and access? What if any of us could, have our way, what are the things that you think are essential in transforming this conversation so that it's not a conversation that is just happening of, call them elites, call them people who are connected to these issues because of particular connections to it, and have a more, broad-based and inclusive conversation that can be actionable?
I'll start. So I actually think that we need to flip the script here, in that sometimes, so pharma can be really helpful in bringing these new technologies to market, but sometimes pharma talking points are actually counterproductive. And I think one of the talking points that we've heard and we will continue to hear here is that our system isn't set up to pay for cures. That is not true. There are plenty of cures that we pay for every single day that are available that are incredible gifts of public science and private industry. Antibiotics, insulin-based therapies, treatments that convert dread disease into chronic manageable illness, whether people have HIV or mental illness or other things. What the problem here is not that we don't know how to pay for cures. It's that we don't have ways of ensuring that people who are underinsured get access to therapies that are expensive, regardless of whether they cost $1 million or they cost $50 out of pocket for access to them. So I would say we know how to ensure people get access to new technology that is expensive. We do this with cancer, we do this with HIV, we do this with many other diseases right now. We provide insurance that is generous to the folks who will gain access to them. We do that in the US with people, with seniors who have cancer now, and Europe does that every day for publicly insured people. So it's not that we don't know how. Again, this is an issue of leadership and will. If we wanted to make these therapies more affordable and accessible, we could. We simply need to make that part of the conversation and part of the leadership goal of scientists and folks who are in charge of the public purse.
Any other perspectives on this? I want to get back to the question of data. You know, everyone's talking about the importance of having data to help drive decisions, both about vulnerable populations and things that we don't know, that can help us to understand how to prioritize and democratize these technologies. What do we do to get the data that we need and get it in the hands of researchers in a way that it will be used, to get in the hands of people who oversee IRBs, to get it in the hands of industry? What needs to happen to have this data be a common resource that is not, you know, sort of squirreled away and not made available and not made sort of forward, you know, facing, so that it's there for all of us to use as we make decisions as people in society?
This is where Genetic Alliance spends most of our time these days, because we believe this is going to be the game changer, the way to level the field. And for us, it really means, how do we forget ownership, because everybody's going to argue somebody else owns the data, but how do we have participants themselves, people themselves, control their data? A system that allows individuals to keep control of their data, keep a string on it, decide who can see it in terms of research. And we have greater participation than ever, especially from these rare and common genetic condition groups that really allow an integration of data, the EHR, PRO, which are patient-reported outcomes required now by FDA, genomic information. And again, the communities that are vulnerable, we're working with a number of communities that are working from Black Lives Matters to youth groups in the Black community, are really appreciating that if people control the data and ultimately make decisions about then who has access to it, again, I would go back to, we can both lower the costs around recruitment, but we can also start to amass the data that will really make a difference around diversity and inclusion in getting the scientific results that we need as well.
Thanks, Sharon. Other perspectives on this question of data?
I wanted to go back a little bit to the cost piece, because I feel like some more needs to be unpacked around that. I know there are new models that are being looked at, particularly related to sickle cell treatment. Sickle cell disease is something that predominantly affects people of African descent. So within the United States, when those therapies are available, chances are a lot of people who would want or need to access them are located in there would be a high Medicaid population in southern states, and there are models around, you know, how can this be provided via those insurance schemes. When you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's just a question of how, who's paying for this, what kind of models exist, and it's not just the medication, it's also the infrastructure, it's the monitoring, it's the patient care. So there are high dollar figures that go along with that, you know, whether it's I've heard everything from, you know, Netflix type model approaches to blended financing. Something needs to change, because we're not talking about like $12 take it for 2-week kind of medications. So it does get complicated. CAR-T as well, which is a treatment for certain types of cancers. We're not just talking about the cost of the medication, but all of the hospital stays, the monitoring, the adverse events that people have that might be unexpected, that then the hospitals have to cope with, the patient has to follow up with. And also then on top of all those costs, where can this take place? What systems have the emergency care, the variety of specialists that can treat somebody who may have an adverse event or who's simply going through a rare type of cancer treatment. So there are a lot of questions that come into this aspect of cost that I think we have a long way to go, and Rena knows much more about this than I do, but I feel like we have a long way to go as a world to figure out how to totally account for those, manage those, and put them in perspective regarding where do we prioritize them as a society? Because as Glenn mentioned earlier, we don't have an infinite amount of money. Some things are going to have to go unpaid for if we shift funds to another location. So I think that needs to be a big conversation that we have not had yet as a world.
Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. I mean, I guess I would say that our estimates suggest 30 therapies at $1 million a pop across a relatively small patient population, in the US at least, maybe even worldwide, does not lead to budget breaking. We have to defund the schools in order to pay for access to these therapies. And so that I think is really important. And that's very different than how we have financed or thought about concerns around spending, for example, for hepatitis C therapies. So I was involved in the subscription model that was established in the United States. Essentially what that is something that we've done for years in the developing world. We buy in bulk, we guarantee access, and in exchange, the company themselves gives us a price discount. And that worked in hepatitis C in Louisiana. It's working for HIV in the US, but it also in other places that are traditionally underinsured. We know how to finance these types of therapies. It's not, like I said, it's not, the budget implications of these therapies are not overwhelming. It's the leadership that is required to say, we're just going to pay for them. We're going to find out we're going to figure out how to pay for them. In the US, I agree with you that there are other attendant costs related to hospitalizations, related to travel, related to workplace adjustments, etc. But again, we can handle those as a system. It's just about putting money into the system and making this a priority. The developing world concerns are very different. There really is a market failure in that there isn't enough money or enough political will to actually put up the money and find and pay for access. That's a different situation that requires, I think, different economic tools to address.
That I think that I'm a subscriber to political will as opposed to leadership as a term, because I think the political will is what we need to be looking at, and not just in government and other kind of regulatory agencies. I'm thinking about the political will of who we are. What is our political will? Because often, in an ideal sense, leadership is a reflection of the mandate that they've been given to go and lead. So I think as a society, we still have to not shrug our responsibility and obligation on what it is we will absolutely expect and insist upon in terms of what's coming back to us in terms of both products, services, treatments, devices, medications, whatever they be that come out of that based on the expenditure of public funds to basically support those things happening. So I think, because I look at leadership and I look at we had a brief conversation offline where we talked about the HIV/AIDS epidemic from the late 80s all the way up to now. And we're now at a point where, in light of all of the billions of dollars that have gone into research and development and everything else, we're at a point now, certainly in the United States, where it's a chronic condition for white Americans, and it's still an epidemic in the Black communities, right? So we've had excellent leadership, which we still have with Dr. Fauci and moving through the COVID-19. But that was a 40-year journey of the HIV episode. And Dr. Fauci was at the forefront of that. So we still had excellent leadership, but there was no political will, because the disparities that disease unfolded and presented to all of us was clear. But there was no political will that we responded and did the appropriate intervention so that we would not be in 2020 looking at still a disparity and an inequity in that disease. So we have to understand what this is really going to be, what's going to be required if we are truly committed to making this particular science technology an equitable one. We can't ignore the obvious things that are absolutely fundamentally broken and flawed in who we are, how we are doing what we do with healthcare and medicine in general. And this is, once again, CRISPR is not an outlier. It's a part of the health and medical system. And so we have to say, we can't just look at it in a vacuum like we're trying to do. We just won't be able to be successful in what we deserve to see as a very favorable and positive outcome in terms of its beneficial impact on the society and on this world. We have to understand who we are, who we've been, and then make a clear-cut decision about who do we want to be. And that's what this is all going to boil down. Who do we want to be? We can come up with all kinds of strategies and scenarios on how to find a path forward, but is it an equitable path? Is it an effective path? Is it a path that's going to really result in the society benefiting from the enormous potential and promise that CRISPR has to offer for all of us?
Thank you very much. And that gets me to, I think, what is my final point for our conversation. We only have a few minutes left. I appreciate all the perspectives you've brought. And I'm kind of just wondering, either just because of where you sit in this rapidly shifting landscape, or because of something that you've heard in our conversation today, I'm wondering if any of you want to communicate like where your North Star is pointing right now. If you could make one thing happen over the next 5 to 7 years, and it could be a particular disease that you want people to focus on. It could be a shift in the way things get paid for. It could be a change in the way that we talk about and engage people around these issues, or the change about collaborative decision making. What's that one thing that you would like to do, either because you're pointing towards something that you think is working, or you have something that you think just really needs to be addressed? Please, any of you, go ahead.
I very much believe in the solution that we're working on, which is to democratize the data, have people control where it goes and who gets to use it. And at the same time, I always believe in working brass tops at the same time to continue to work on policies like getting whole genome sequencing paid for by Medicaid, and making sure that other technologies are included as part of things like CARES 2.0, that we're going to need both levels, and that we not have this be a US only conversation, because we know that, and especially in rare diseases, we've always worked this way. It has to be international. And so I look for the dialogue to be global and to be happening where people eat, work, play, and pray, because it's not going to be good just to have this happen in ivory towers, as we've said.
Thank you, Sharon. Anyone else have thoughts about that?
I'm really excited about the opportunity for public-private sector collaboration here. I do believe that many of these innovative companies are going to bring products to market and are going to want those products to be used by the people who can benefit from them the most. And so finding ways that there are win-wins where cash-strapped public payers or private payers can work with innovator companies to ensure that these therapies are used, and that the next generation of therapies are also brought to market and used, I think is a really, really ripe for collaboration, and there'll be new models. We're already seeing the state of Massachusetts move in this direction. We are already seeing some private insurers work with private companies to make sure therapies are paid for and access is provided. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to be able to solve the access problem, but it does require sustained attention from us all.
Thank you, Rena.
Yeah, I mean, my North Star is really how do we decrease disparities globally when it comes to precision medicine and new approaches to modernizing healthcare. And one of the key elements of that is really inclusion. So that starts with consent. What are we doing around consent to make sure that there is comprehension, that people are truly informed, engaged, and feel and are made part of the system, and that does come from the top, certainly. And also with that, something I hope to start working on much more over the next 5 to 7 years, David, is the idea of benefit sharing. So again, how are we justly including the participants in research in the benefits of the results of that research? And these can be monetary, they can be non-monetary, but we need to be much more inclusive in thinking about just ways of distributing value back down the chain.
Glenn, any last thoughts about what's guiding you North Star wise? You've had some great perspectives to inform our conversation already.
Thank you. I guess my North Star is that is to see us reach a point where healthcare is truly a right and not a privilege. And I think in light of the fact that we do rightly or wrongly have a healthcare system, as I mentioned earlier, is tied to the free market, the potential for the privileged part of healthcare to dominate the trajectory is ever looming. So my North Star is to see us reach a point that even though we have a hybrid system that is both humanitarian in terms of care, and it's also a commercial venture as well, I think that my North Star is to see us reach a point where we can actually have the predominant leading force being healthcare as a right, and within that to try to find out how the commercial and the economic aspects of it can be satisfied. But I think we, for whatever reason, because of the absence of a uniform set of voices that covers all of the spectrum of stakeholders and other kinds of issues, I think we're at a point where privilege is what drives both research, development, and implementation of both CRISPR and other things. And I'll end by saying, I just want to point out that at the beginning of the current pandemic that we're in, the Center for Disease Control's initial guidance on what to do if you have a suspicion that you have been infected. They told you not to go to the emergency room, do not go to your doctor, to call your doctor, and they will arrange for you to have a test done. Now, just because of the exclusion of all the stakeholders' needs and interests in that conversation that came up with those guidelines, it totally overlooked the fact that a significant majority of the people in the United States, particularly, don't have a doctor. So this is the driving point of my thought, is just us to understand how fundamentally flawed our system is because of the systemic racism that is and bias that's inherent in it, that we have to really rise up high to be able to do what's necessary to try to correct this so that we can create equity with CRISPR. But we have to once again go back and understand the extent to which there are significant structural flaws in our system.
Thank you for your perspective on that and for bringing that forward throughout our conversation. I'll end with mine and then turn it back to our organizers. My goal here is that the conversation be extended and broadened, and also that it maintain the thoughtful character that each of you brought to this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we're one of the organizers of what will be a global discussion on human genome editing over the next couple of years. And I think it's really important that it go beyond people who are technically sort of connected to these issues and thinking about it every day, that everyone bring it, because we're all going to be impacted by this, this rapidly changing technology and the tools and inequities that are built into it and the uncertainties that are built into it. So I hope everyone who is listening, I appreciate everyone's questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everything. I hope you go and talk to someone about this. And I hope that you bring it up with them in a way that reflects some of the perspectives and ideas and thoughtful questioning, forward-looking perspectives that we heard from our fantastic panelists. I want to thank all of them right now for giving us this time. And I want to turn it back to our organizers from CRISPR-Con, and I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an honor.
So much.
Thank
you.
Before we close, on behalf of the Keystone Policy Center, I want to thank you to our panelists and to our moderator for engaging in this important dialogue. Thank you, David, Sharon, Glenn, Rena, and Alyssa. Thank you again to the Innovative Genomics Institute for your thought leadership and partnership for this session. Thanks as well to our sponsors of CRISPR-Con and to our advisors, which are all listed at CRISPRcon.org. Thank you to the audience who tuned in to listen and to contribute questions. Today's panel session will be available on the CRISPR-Con YouTube channel and website within 24 hours. Our next panel discussion will be Thursday, October 29th from 11 to 12:30 Eastern Time. We will be focusing on priority and agenda setting and the role of funders and philanthropists in setting the gene editing agenda. This will be the final session of CRISPR-Con 2020 virtual. This concludes our live content for today, but you can also continue the dialogue on Twitter at #CRISPRCon2020. Check out past content on our YouTube channel and in the expo. You can visit our expo at any time between now and the close of programming on Thursday. Thanks again to all who have participated today. Please carry on the conversation.